All right, so here we go. We are going to explain what is going on during the menstrual cycle. So this picture, which I probably over blew up because it's a little fuzzy, but this is depicting the interaction of certain structures in the brain and then information that's going on in the bloodstream and then the actual ovaries that are going to control the menstrual cycle. So you see up at the very top, it says hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. Okay. So what we're looking at is the main structure of the brain that controls our hormone pattern, whether you're male or you're female. The main structure that controls your hormone pattern is the hypothalamus. There's a particular part of the hypothalamus that secretes the key factors that will activate the pituitary gland. So you see on the right-hand side, that yellow blob, it's labeled the posterior pituitary. It's a little part of, it dangles off of your brain, and it's allowed to communicate directly with your bloodstream, whereas the brain has a blood-brain barrier that kind of prevents that kind of direct communication. Because the pituitary gland is not technically in the brain, it's just attached to it, it is able to communicate through the bloodstream. So the hypothalamus secretes hormones that will then, they're called gonadotropin releasing hormones, that then cause the pituitary gland to send out luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. See that in the picture. Those hormones tell the ovary to ripen an egg. Once the egg has been released during ovulation, the corpus luteum, the body that had been holding that egg, as it degenerates, it releases estradiol and progesterone. So estradiol is estrogen, and then progesterone. So this big burst of these hormones enter the bloodstream, and that information goes back up to the brain, and that causes the hypothalamus to stop sending the gonadotropin releasing hormone, because obviously ovulation just happened. And so we take a little break for a second. Once the progesterone and estrogen get low enough in the bloodstream, that'll trigger the hypothalamus to tell the pituitary to send out the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone, which will cause the ovary to ripen an egg. Once the ovulation happens, then all the progesterone and estradiol is released, and the cycle continues. Okay, let's break it down a little bit more. First off, before I go to my next slide, I want to get an agreement that we're going to call luteinizing hormone LH, and we're going to call follicle stimulating hormone FSH, so that it'll be a little simpler to talk about what we're talking about. Okay. So here we have the different parts of the body that are being impacted as the menstrual cycle goes on. So at the very top, you see the brain, and you see that it says that the hypothalamus is releasing GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. That causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. Okay, now in the next layer of the panel, you see panel B. It says blood levels of FSH are the blue line, and the LH are the pink line. So while there is a burst of FSH, you see it right before the vertical line that is depicting ovulation. You see that, you get a spike of FSH, but boy, look at the spike of LH that you get right before ovulation. So right before ovulation is when the bloodstream would be experiencing the lowest levels of estrogen and progesterone. So this spike of estrogen, the spike of LH is associated with ovulation that now will cause another spike in estrogen. So it's all this finely tuned, slow motion dance that occurs over, on average, 28 days. Now, if we go down another level on the panel to panel C, we see what's going on in the ovary. And so I was mentioning that we've got follicle stimulating hormone. Well, it's going to stimulate the follicle to grow and ripen that egg during that first part of the menstrual cycle. So you see how the egg goes in the far left from teeny tiny to a nice big balloon with an egg in it that ruptures on the day of ovulation. And then you see after ovulation, the corpus luteum, the body that had been, containing the egg, starts to degenerate. right? And that degeneration process causes the release of progesterone and estrogen. So that takes us down to panel D. So you have a spike of estrogen right before ovulation, which then it kind of drops, and then it goes up and then is staying level from, a couple of days after ovulation through the rest of the menstrual period. You see that progesterone, on the other hand, is low, 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 low. Ovulation happens, it goes up and it stays way up for the, second half of the menstrual cycle. So our estrogen levels spike right before ovulation and then stay higher after ovulation thanks to that corpus luteum secreting estrogen. And then the progesterone levels just jump for the second half of the menstrual cycle. Now, the final part of the panel is showing us what's going on in the uterus in the endometrial layer. And so, of course, our menstrual cycle starts with menstruation. So you see that the endometrial layer is being shed. And then you see as soon as it's shed, it starts building back up again. And so at ovulation, it's pretty good. But by the time a fertilized egg would get there, now it's nice and fluffy there by day, 26, 27, 28. That endometrial layer is nice and thick and blood rich and a nice pillow in case a fertilized egg were to show up. And if one doesn't, it just starts to slough off again in the next menstrual cycle. And the cycle continues. So these are all the different things. And what I like about this panel is it kind of lines them all up so you can see what's going on with, the brain, the hormones, the, ovary, the endometrial layer all at one time. And you see how they all sort of work together. So I'm drawing some little lines to break it up into those phases that have been in that circle that we saw before. The far right green one is actually breaking off. That's the start of the next menstrual cycle. This depiction is a little bit confusing because it takes us past day 28, which should be the end of the cycle and should be wrapping around to the other side. So I drew some green lines to kind of show you where ovulation is there in the middle, the end of menstruation on average there on the left, and then the start of the next period on the right. All right, let's talk a little bit about some problems that accompany menstruation. Well, this one is actually the absence of menstruation, amenorrhea. A means no, meno means month, rhea means discharge, actually, or liquid. And so no monthly liquid. So this is a term used to describe a person who has been menstruating, right? This would not be a word that we would use for, let's say, a prepubescent girl who has not had her first period. We would use this term to refer to somebody who has been menstruating and now they are no longer menstruating. Now, there are several things that can cause amenorrhea. When I teach this class face-to-face, I always try and get people to generate the 3 causes of amenorrhea. And usually pretty quickly, people come up with, too low a body fat, because we know that, female athletes oftentimes will not have their periods, or long-distance runners. They won't have their periods because they just don't have enough body fat. It turns out for healthy menstruation to be maintained, women need about 18% body fat. Probably not more than about 30% body fat, though. You get too much body fat and it can actually, like I was saying about gynecomastia, right? If you have a lot of fat cells around your abdomen, it can actually generate its own estrogen, which then can be quite the disruptor of menstrual cycles. So too much body fat is not necessarily good for menstruation, but definitely, you need at least 18% to be actively menstruating. So yeah, body fat is one reason for amenorrhea. Another one that people oftentimes come up with is anorexia, right? Like not just that the body is too low, it's like the stress of not eating enough, and stress can cause amenorrhea. So psychologically, if we remember back to the idea that the hypothalamus governs the pituitary gland, and actually on that earlier picture, I didn't point out that the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that determines whether we're feeling like we're under threat, right? It's that emotional part of our brain that is cued for detecting fearful events. If we're under stress and we're perceiving ourselves to be under threat, it can interfere with menstruation also. So psychological factors can cause amenorrhea. It's kind of an irony that if a woman is kind of worried that maybe she hadn't used birth control or something, and so she's possibly pregnant, and she's really, really depending on her period showing up to reassure her that that's the time that the psychological factor is going to kick in, and we're actually not going to be menstruating for a couple of days because we just are too stressed out. It's kind of ironic that that's how it works, but it is. A lot of times people have difficulty with the third cause of amenorrhea, and it's actually probably the number one cause of amenorrhea. And it's a cause of amenorrhea that about 90% of women will experience at some point in their lives. So, pregnancy. Pregnancy causes amenorrhea, right? You do not have your monthly periods while pregnant. Now, I've watched enough episodes of I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant to know that there are women who claim that they menstruated all the way through their pregnancy. And while they may have bled, they were not menstruating. Hopefully, my vivid slide showing the shedding of the endometrial layer will convince you that you cannot be shedding your endometrial layer and maintaining your pregnancy. That's called a miscarriage. So women who bleed during their pregnancies, it's something else. The most common cause of bleeding during pregnancy is placenta previa, where the placenta is actually too close to the opening of the uterus, and so it's it's actually bleeding. And that's a life-threatening situation for the baby. It's not something to say, oh, I'm just having my normal period. You are amenorrheic during pregnancy. So most common cause is the one that most people don't generate too easily. Dysmenorrhea. Okay, I already told you what meno and rhea means. So dys means bad. So what we mean by bad is usually that it's painful. It also could be like protractedly long, right? It's bad monthly liquids, right? Bad monthly liquids. So we have a person who they have horrible cramping. Might be an example of somebody who would be diagnosed with dysmenorrhea. And I don't mean cramping like a lot of women experience where it's like, oh, my back kind of hurts, or oh, my abdomen, I need a heating pad. But like stabbing pains where like it feels like something is dramatically wrong, not just, achy or something like that. It also could be, like I said, really long periods. So periods that are lasting, closer to 2 weeks than the 1 week that it should be lasting. And then it can also be really heavy periods. For some women, it'll, if you're bleeding through a maxi pad in an hour, you might be a candidate for dysmenorrhea. Now, I mean, a lot of women, they'll have like one time, during the period, they'll bleed through a maxi pad or a super plus tampon in an hour. But then the rest of it builds up to that heavy moment, then it builds away from the heavy moment. But for a person with dysmenorrhea, it's like for days, you're having like almost to the point where you need a blood transfusion kind of shedding of blood. So these are really dramatic examples, in other words, of what's going on with menstruation. And then we have premenstrual syndrome, which is not technically part of menstruation, right? Because it's premenstrual syndrome. It's something that happens before the menstrual period. And so that would be, usually it's going to be the 2 to 3 days prior to the onset of the period. So it comes before period starts, and then it's called syndrome because there's like a cluster of symptoms that have been attributed to this phase right before the onset of the period. It happens during that part of the menstrual cycle that we call the luteal phase. But like I said, it's usually limited to the couple of days right before, and that's right before the period starts. And that's because of, the high levels of progesterone that the woman is experiencing and the high levels of estrogen that she's experiencing. So I thought I'd share with you some really common symptoms that go along with premenstrual syndrome. So you do not have to have all of these to be diagnosed with this syndrome. That's why it's called a syndrome. It's like this constellation of sort of a pick and choose deli version of symptoms. You don't have to have them all. So things that people complain about are things like just feeling a sense of tension like sort of anxious for no real reason. It's not how they normally feel. It's just these couple of days they feel like that. Their mood may be depressed. Depressed does not necessarily mean sad. It just means that their mood is not as, effusive as it normally would be. And so a person who normally is easy to smile is like not smiling as much, that kind of thing. It's not, the crying spells would be the part where we're talking about being sad, right? So crying spells, mood swings. So it might be, I'm feeling fine and then all of a sudden I'm just feeling completely hopeless, right? A lot of times the mood that they're experiencing is much more like irritability than it is like sadness, right? It's not that the person necessarily feels sad. It's that they just feel like everything's irritating them, or is angering them. And for a lot of women, that's not part of their sort of self-identity to be easy to anger. And so it can make them, that can make a woman feel very concerned, because I don't normally have this short, trigger anger problem. And then, these couple of days, I just can't really control my anger. And I find myself yelling at my kids or whatever. Appetite changes and food craving, might be more hungry than usual. It might be that, you just can't help but eat like chocolate or whatever. Insomnia, having difficulty sleeping, might not want to be around other people who you normally like to be around, social withdrawal. And then difficulty concentrating. We have, this poor concentration can manifest itself in, forgetting things. It could actually manifest itself in, sort of in the middle of your sentence, you kind of forget what the theme of the conversation was, kind of, this sort of absent-mindedness. Some physical signs and symptoms. It could be, any combination of any of these are possible, but, you could have joint or muscle pain that, appears without necessarily being, you're not sick, you haven't been working out heavily, you just are feeling that kind of achiness. Might have a headache or feel a lot of fatigue. There might be fluid retention, so you might find that your rings don't fit very well, or that you've got like indentations on your feet after you take your shoes off because you're retaining fluid. That fluid might be being retained in the abdomen, or you might feel like the bloating is actually inside more, and that could be because of the swelling of the uterus. Breast tenderness, really common complaint. Acne flare-ups, constipation or diarrhea, either one, change in the toileting habits, might have a sudden onset of yeast infection where, itchy and like that. And then the final physical symptom that I have on this list is clumsiness, where we find that women during the premenstrual phase are more likely to drop things, more likely to trip on things, just these little kinds of like, just like we have the poor concentration cognitively, we may have sort of poor concentration physically, right? So that it causes us to not pick our foot up as high as we should have, or not really notice that there's a curb or something like that. And so we can end up with sort of these clumsy effects. So it can be any combination of these symptoms. Now, I can tell you that worldwide, the number one most common symptoms are the breast tenderness, the abdominal bloating are the most common worldwide symptoms. In the US, we oftentimes focus much more on the emotional and behavioral symptoms, and we'll say things like, well, I feel really irritable, or I have these food cravings. And so when we see cultural differences, we look at not only the possibility that these are completely biological and they just manifest themselves differently, but also that different cultures might sort of value different things, or give permission for different things, or, you know what I mean? And so it's possible that some of the symptoms that American women report are actually also being experienced by women around the world, but maybe they just don't describe those things. Like maybe they don't think it's worthy of bringing up, or maybe they're embarrassed of it because it's not part of their culture for them to have these experiences. So we have to be really, careful. I mean, American women will report pretty much all these symptoms. Other parts of the world, they tend to focus on the physical symptoms. Now, I did want to point out that just because I'm moody doesn't mean that you're not irritating. One of the things that we have to remember about premenstrual syndrome is that we don't want to use it as a catch-all reason why women might behave in an irritable way, right? A lot of times, if a woman behaves like as if she's irritated, other people will ask really sweet questions like, are you on the rag? Or something like that. And it really diminishes, women's ability to, sort of cope in the world, like be in power, those kinds of things. If any time that she gets irritated, it's attributed to biology. Like maybe I'm irritated because you didn't get this part of the assignment done in time, and so now I can't do my part of it, right? Like it might be just what's going on in the circumstance. It may have nothing to do with her hormones. And so I think a lot of times we blame PMS for things that we should maybe say are completely legitimate reactions to what's going on in the context. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Plus, I just love this meme. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here, and I'm going to come back and talk about internal sexual differentiation and external sexual differentiation.